So today's talk is about an aspect of my recent book, which you'll see here, Deserters of the First World War, The Home Front. Came out in June last year. So in 1915, deserters Harry Chapman and James Charlton travelled around the Ely area, tricking gullible civilians into giving them money. The pair claimed that they'd lost their railway passes and needed the cash for train fares to rejoin their regiment, and they specifically targeted those they felt might be more trusting, including a minister of religion and a number of widowed ladies. When they were finally caught and appeared in court, the newspaper described them as scamps in khaki, and that's where the title of this talk comes from, and indeed the chapter in the book. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the activities of some of the deserters on the home front, where they strayed into criminality to support themselves. So before we start properly, let me tell you something I am not going to be talking about. I'm sure you all remember the series with Paul McGann, and I've even had a review on Amazon of my book criticising me for not addressing this. If you're here today, see me afterwards. So just a quick note as to why I do not, and I'm sure I probably don't have to say this to most of you. The Monocle Mutineer was a very entertaining programme, but it was not factual. And the BBC got themselves into a bit of bother, if you'll remember, suggesting that it was. They took so many liberties with the truth that Julian Putkowski, I'm sure is familiar to a lot of you, resigned as their historical advisor and didn't want anything to do with the project. Percy Topless did exist. In fact, there were 3 different men by that name, and a mixture of all 3 and a good dollop of fiction was dumped on the top to produce this character. So enjoy it as a bit of entertainment, but it is not fact, and we shall not mention it again. So how did I get to deserters? Well, I started to think about them when I was researching my earlier book, Shameless Plug, which you'll currently see on the screen, still available from all good bookshops. And the reason was that I was finding in my research on widows, I was finding a number of war widows who were defrauded by men who'd wooed them, spent all their money, then disappeared or were arrested. And these men quite often turned out to be deserters. So I started to think, well, hang on a second, what's going on here? So once your army pay has stopped, you need to find some way of supporting yourself. So why not get somebody else to support you instead? This postcard's entitled A Deserter, and if you look in the background, especially if you can see the side screens, you can see the troop marching off there and leaving him in the cornfield with his sweetheart. And war widows, it seems, were targeted by deserters, firstly because they were psychologically vulnerable given their recent bereavement, but also because they had money and could get more. So war widows were getting pensions. It's not a lot, but if you're a deserter with nothing, it's something. But if a war widow marries you, her pension stops, but she gets a nice lump sum of, depending on what stage of the war it was, either a year's pension or 2 years' pension. Now that is a lot of money. It'll be more money at one time than any of them ever had in their lives. Unfortunately, she wouldn't see it all if she was sweet-talked into marrying one of these guys, because they would wait until she had it, then take it and run off with it, or just help her to spend it by drinking their way through it. And sometimes they'd then move on to another unsuspecting widow. Ada Taylor lived in Wallsend, and she lost her husband in July 1915. On a day trip to the seaside resort of Whitley Bay that October, she met a young man called Charles Bell. He turned up on her doorstep a few days later proposing marriage. Now, Ada declined, thinking it was too soon after her bereavement to contemplate a wedding, but he persisted and persisted for quite some time, and they were married in May 1916. So the couple had a week of happiness before the police caught up with Private Charles Bell, deserter from the West Yorkshire Regiment. And further shocks were to come for Ada when she discovered that Bell had a wife and children living in Leeds. Bell claimed that his hospital stays when he was wounded during his war service had robbed him of any memory of his wife and children. And the judge who then sentenced Bell to 6 months' imprisonment with hard labour remarked that some men found it difficult to forget that they were married. So I got to thinking, well, hang on, how many of these guys are there? I seem to be finding them quite often. How many of them could there have been? How do you survive in a military state when you were on the run from the military? And the answer to that question as to how many there were lots and lots. So when talking about deserters in the First World War, the topic that often comes up is the men who were shot at dawn and later pardoned. But the reality is there were only 309 of those. And they've been given really a disproportionate level of attention. And I don't want to get bogged down in statistics, but this gives you more of an idea. So on your far left are the 266 who were shot for desertion. And we then shoot right up to more than 82,000 court-martials on the home front alone for desertion and absence, 126,000, nearly 127,000 on all fronts for desertion and absence, and the number of men struck off the strength, that means they're missing for more than 21 days, so are declared deserters, on all fronts is 146,733. And the thing is that that's only the tip of the iceberg, because these are just the court-martial statistics and those struck off the strength. Many never went anywhere near a court-martial, either because they were recaptured quite quickly or because they were dealt with under their commanding officer's powers of summary punishment, which meant they didn't have to go anywhere near a court-martial. So the real figures are lost forever, and so they're obviously higher than this. So how do you track these men down then? Well, you need the civilian police to do most of the work. So let's now look at the role of the Police Gazette. It was so named in 1839, previously being called Hue and Cry, which I think is a great title, and I wish they'd kept that. It's essentially the police national computer of its day. It's distributed to forces nationwide, and it carries notices of crimes, appeals for information, apprehensions sought, and descriptions of suspects in custody in case they're wanted elsewhere in the country. Once war is declared, they have to have a second edition every week to carry the names of deserters. And from the start of the war, the Gazette carries an average of around 1,000 names a week of people that are wanted for desertion. And that's 1,000 different names every week as well. Because once a man's declared a deserter, his details are sent to the Police Gazette with his name, his regimental number, his corps, details of his appearance. So basically the information that's on his attestation forms, his pre-army trade, where he enlisted and where he was born, in addition to the date and location of his desertion, so that the civilian police can hopefully use that information to try and pick him up. After conscription comes in, as I say on here, there's a whole other section of people that haven't answered their call-up papers, and that's another 1,000 names a week. So police officers become particularly keen readers of the Police Gazette Deserters edition because they get a reward, a financial reward, whenever they deposit a deserter before the magistrate's court. So at a time when police pay is not high, and as the war goes on is lagging behind inflation, it was a good source of extra income for your average police officer because they keep the reward themselves. They don't have to give it to their force. They keep it themselves. And some names appear suspiciously regularly in the reports of people who are arresting deserters. There was one man that was described in the paper, he's a detective constable from Halifax, who was described as a man to be feared by all deserters. A report in the Bradford Weekly Telegraph in May 1915 said the Bradford police had their own estimate of the respective value of Navy and Army deserters, and the police were bemoaning the fact that there was a new stipendiary magistrate in Bradford who'd essentially cut their rates. Under the old bloke, the market value of a deserter was 15 shillings to £1. Many constables found the scanning of the Gazette very remunerative. But the new man had reduced this to a mere 5 shillings, meaning that the Bradford police were far less interested now in arresting army deserters. Navy deserters, however, were much more valuable. A detective bagged one from HMS Partridge. See what I did there? Well, actually, I didn't because I got that straight from the newspaper. But he not only got £3 reward, but he got a free trip to take him back to the ship because the Navy didn't send anyone to pick him up. So the Gazette continued during the war with its usual function of alerting forces to criminals, but now increasingly the two elements would combine because deserters were now committing offences on the home front. So the things I want to talk about today are really bookended by two murders, one at either end of the war. The first one, on the 12th of August 1914, was at the incongruously named Fairyland on Tottenham Court Road in London, which there's a picture of it here. though I think the picture's taken for the benefit of the people that have just decorated it rather than the place itself. And it's an amusement arcade in London on Tottenham Court Road, and fatally it includes a shooting range. So one of the recent patrons of that establishment is a man called Donald Lesbini, who'd been there a few times for some target practice. Had he not deserted from his regiment, of course, he could have had all the target practice he wanted for free, but he'd run off from the Worcestershire regiment a few days before the declaration of war. He was a serial deserter. He'd joined the army straight from Borstal in 1911, and he was a tailor in the regiment, and he complained that the reason he'd deserted was because he was being bullied, that he was being subject to anti-Semitic bullying. He objected to that treatment very strongly, but not because it was racist, because he said he wasn't Jewish. That was his objection. He was Greek. He turns up at Fairyland and he takes exception to the attendant Alice Story referring to him as Ike, which is a nickname or derogatory name for someone of Jewish descent at the time. Though she apologised to him when challenged, Lesbini chases her through the premises with the revolver and shoots her in the chest from close range, killing her almost instantly, and he's detained at the scene by witnesses and charged with murder. At his trial, he says that his intention that day was to kill himself, not anybody else, because he was so depressed at everyone looking down on him. And he claimed at his trial that the revolver had gone off accidentally as he chased her through the amusement arcade. So that was contradicted by the eyewitnesses, and he was convicted and sentenced to death. But a few days before he was due to hang, his sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. Now, he was clearly very mentally unwell, hence him not being hung in the first place, and his behaviour in prison became increasingly paranoid and odd. And in 1931, he was finally certified as insane and transferred to Broadmoor, where he remained until he died in the 1950s. Now, Lesbini was not the only soldier who had his sentence reviewed, though the motivation for his review was obviously somewhat different. In 1914, 381 men were released under the royal prerogative of mercy to allow them to enlist in the forces. Some of them were rejoining the military because they'd been in the military earlier and were then kicked out because they got these prison sentences. Now, a lot of these were young men who were serving sentences in Borstals. Now, this actually continues as the war goes on, especially in late 1916, early 1917, when manpower's at a premium, and prison governors are asked to put forward the names of suitable men who are deemed to be prisoners of military age who've served half their sentence and are fit for general service abroad and likely to make good soldiers. Aliens are excluded, and men whose sentences are 3 months or less, or who only have a month left to serve. Convicts released for military service in this way are released on licence, and the prison authorities would take them to the recruiting station, and if they weren't accepted, would just take them back to prison. There's not as many of them released under this 1917 scheme. So let's have a brief look at a few of the men that have benefited from this. So Victor March, or Marsh, who was a career burglar, he was serving a sentence of 3 years penal servitude and 5 years preventative detention on top for burgling high-class residences in Hampstead. He is eligible for release under this scheme because he's also, however brief his career, a former soldier. He'd served in the army in 1910 before being discharged due to this hefty prison sentence. The second one, John Butler Milburn, he was serving a civilian sentence, ironically, for wearing a uniform without authority. I don't know any more details, so I'm presuming it was a uniform of a higher rank than that to which he was entitled, because after they give him that sentence, they then discover that he's actually a deserter. So they return him back to his battalion, where he gets 28 days punishment, isn't court-martialed, 28 days punishment for desertion by the Tyneside Irish, and then continues his service. And the last one, John James Bailey, a delightful character who appears to benefit from the release schemes twice, because at the outbreak of war, he's serving a sentence of 3 years Borstal detention for burgling a church of all places and stealing altar vases. And he commits this crime as a deserter because he is a soldier in May 1913 when he does that. So he is released under that scheme, the initial scheme, I think, because by March 1915 he's serving abroad. He later claims to have been with the 7th Gloucesters at Gallipoli when he appears before the Bristol Assize Court in July 1916 On this occasion, he has cut the throat of a woman called Rhonda Witt when she refuses to have sex with him. He's originally charged with attempted murder. Thankfully, she isn't that badly injured. He eventually pleads guilty to felonious wounding. We'd call that wounding today. But he's only given 9 months imprisonment. And again, he's released early to go back into the army. By June 1918, the Home Office are no longer interested in this scheme, saying that the need for manpower is not as pressing. And in June 1918, they reject a couple of applications from prison governors for the release of older men, with the memo stating, "There's too much dishonesty already in the non-combatant branches of the army for the Home Office to add to it by expediting the enlistment of thieves from prison." Now, we'll catch up with these three a bit later on. So, thinking about the crimes that deserters commit on the home front. Charity cases, I've called them here. Pretending to be collecting for charity is a popular ruse. All kinds of charities were setting themselves up to help the war effort or the plight of refugees, and it was very easy to con people in this way in the days before charities were properly regulated. So a couple of examples. A Private Thomas from the Cornish Light Infantry was arrested in Stratford, where he was shaking cigar boxes, purportedly for the Prince of Wales Fund and for the Red Cross. But in truth, he was a deserter from his battalion at Falmouth and was spending the proceeds of this particular collection in the pubs of London. 2 Royal Irish Fusiliers appeared in court in Lurgan. They had a more specific purpose, claiming to be collecting on behalf of the Ulster Volunteer Force to buy a motor car for use at the front. W.J. Kettle, aka Cadden, and David Thompson were actually deserters, and the cash was going straight into their own pockets. Now, 18,000 charities were set up during the First World War. It's often difficult to tell the legitimate from the fraudulent. I've got 2 sets of examples here. So on the first line, it's the Fresh Air Fund, Tubs for Tommies, and the Spiritualist Motor Ambulance Fund. The second line, Heroes Poultry Farms, the War Orphans Fund, and the Cripples Pension Society. I don't know if anybody wished to hazard a guess as to which one of those sets is actually true and which was just a ruse. Amazingly, it's the first line which is legitimate. So there was a Fresh Air Fund, a fund called Tubs for Tommies, which was about supplying disposable baths to the Western Front, and there was a Spiritualist Motor Ambulance Fund. The second 3 were entirely fictitious and fraudulent. So as I've said on here, 18,000 charities established during this time, and this is one of the reasons why we have the regulations that we have today about the charities. Is these regulations came in initially during the First World War to try and combat this kind of thing. Now, similar to charity fraud is a basic begging fraud, at playing the old soldier, pretending to be wounded and asking for money. So this postcard is actually an interwar postcard. I'll read it for anybody that's struggling. It says, "Yes, lady, I'm an old RAF man and I had my horse shot out from under me at the Battle of Jutland." An exaggeration clearly, but this kind of thing was going on a lot. The Manchester Guardian said that it was a crying shame how many of these men were hanging around at the moment. But it wasn't unusual because, of course, as we know, traditionally soldiers were not well regarded, and once their military service was finished, were not well looked after. So the general public were accustomed to seeing soldiers or veterans begging on the streets. So you add to that the new patriotic thrust given by the fact that we're at war, and it was quite an easy thing to do. So the quote here from Arthur Cunningham, who was pretending to be a wounded soldier in London in 1915 and was found with a lot of money on him when the police stopped him. He told the court, "You only have to sit in Hyde Park and tell the tale and the money flows in." Wounded soldiers often had miraculous recoveries when challenged by police officers and could suddenly run like the wind, throwing their crutches away as they ran. And in some cases, it was said that men had only joined up in the first place in order to get a uniform, so they could then desert and use that uniform as a tool to commit frauds of this kind and others. Some of them in uniform were deserters like that, clearly, but some had never been in the army at all. And there was a moral panic in 1917 about criminals posing as discharged soldiers, so the Home Office asked the police to be vigilant about it. The police, not uncommonly in my experience, got the wrong end of the stick and started harassing genuine disabled veterans who were seeking to make some extra money by playing music on the street. The Liverpool police stopped 2 men playing in the city and proudly reported it back to the Home Office. I impressed upon them that their being out playing the street organ tended to bring discredit on the army. The response was not what they expected, with the Home Office basically telling them not to be so stupid, saying if a crippled soldier prefers earning money that way than by work indoors, then it's no business of the police. Because that's not what they'd asked them to do in the first place. It was the frauds that they were trying to get rid of, not genuinely wounded men playing street music. As I say, that's something that was going on before the war and given an extra impetus during the war. That's a very simple kind of fraud, obviously, but my favourite criminal deserters are the ones who are a little bit more sophisticated in their modus operandi, so we'll meet a few now. The most audacious ones were fraudsters who did not hide away in coal cellars and attics like a lot of deserters, but cavorted in plain sight, even specifically drawing attention to themselves and committing very cheeky frauds. I only have time to speak about a couple of them today, but there are lots of these. I could have picked a lot of different examples. I have spoken briefly about these two before, but I've done a deeper dive now, as they say, on YouTube for a fuller story. So, first, the extravagantly named and extravagantly dressed in this picture, Lorenzo Reginald Bell, aka Lance Corporal Laurie Bell, a true Scotsman here and no mistake, kilt and everything, except he's not Scottish at all and he's born in Kent. This photo has him, it's hard to read at the top, but this photo is entitled Gallant Scot of the Trenches. He'd served in 5 different regiments, some in the 2 years before war was declared, but he was constantly in trouble and he was actually serving a sentence of military detention when war broke out. Like a number of the fraudsters I've come across, he was a complete fantasist and he couldn't resist telling tall tales. He started by writing letters to people at home that he knew, telling them lies about what he'd been up to, describing being with the troops who retreat to Paris in 1914, when he was probably still in jail, actually. November 1914, he's in Bradford, and this picture appears in a Bradford newspaper calling him Lance Corporal Laurie Bell, saying he's in Bradford recuperating from war wounds, and he's already won the DSO with the 1st Gordon Highlanders at Cambrai. During this period in Bradford, he's in Bradford for a couple of months. He's reportedly also working for the local recruiting officer, but he's a deserter at this point, not a war hero. He tells the newspaper and anybody that will listen a tall tale about being in France 3 times, being sent home wounded each time, and this is between August and November 1914, and being in the process of writing a letter to his sweetheart in Bradford when he sustained the injury that currently detains him in the city. He adds the flourish that he didn't even know he was wounded until a single drop of blood fell onto the letter as he was writing it, and that this letter is now treasured by his friends in Bradford. The Shipley Times and Express declares that Bell presents a striking example to single young men who have not ventured to try their luck for the first time. Of course, the articles are complete nonsense. He's never even been abroad, let alone 3 times, and been wounded on each occasion. He's with the 3rd Gordons, who remain a reserve battalion at Aberdeen, not the 1st, who went off to France early in the war. So he uses this wounded soldier ruse, but then later he adds a twist by pretending to be an officer during several of his frauds. If a soldier's uniform, as we've said, garnered more respect during the war than would ordinarily have been the case, then an officer's uniform was even better. Wearing an officer's uniform takes advantage of the huge class bias that there is prevalent at the time, where an officer is a gentleman, his word is trusted, and he is a cut above the ordinary Tommy. So Laurie Bell eventually leaves Bradford in January 1915 with an officer's belt and sword that he's stolen, and he presents himself at the Tower of London, no less, in an officer's uniform, claiming that he's been sent to buy a revolver and handing them over a worthless cheque. They hand him the revolver, he disappears. He then's next seen in Aberdeen attempting to commit frauds again whilst pretending to be an officer, and he's caught and sentenced to 6 months in prison. He then gets a further 3 months inside when they finally realise that he's the man that nicked that revolver from the Tower of London, and the army then discharge him as a result of that sentence. But he fraudulently enlists again in a false name. Plug for the Western Front Association Operation Alias here, as you'll know all about that and how many men did that. And amazingly, he does have a Commonwealth war grave. He dies in India in July 1919, not from some brave actions in some kind of conflict, but from an abscess on his liver. He's there with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers this time, and he's previously served in Mesopotamia, but he's misbehaved throughout, and he was about to be sent back to the glasshouse again when he actually died. Our other example here is Frank Griffin Hodgson, or should I call him by one of his many other names, Frank Hodgson, Frank Hodgson, Frank Griffin Hodgson, Frank Carr, Frank Griffin Carr, or Frank Carter. For those of you planning a life of crime, by the way, tip from the top here, it's a good idea if you're going to use aliases to keep the same first name, because you've got less chance of being tripped up then, so you're welcome. Frank is first convicted at 14 when he escapes from a reformatory ship. I can't quite get to the bottom of why he was there in the first place, but he escapes from a reformatory ship and goes on a burglary spree around Merseyside. He's then sent back to the ship for those offences. Between 1908 and 1913, he appears before the courts on a number of occasions for thefts of all kinds, being sent to Borstal in Kent in 1911. He's from the Manchester area originally, and he briefly escapes from the Borstal for a few days in 1912. He's released in 1912 and he enlists in the army in the name of Frank Carr, but he's discharged as mentally unfit in December 1913 after making an attempt to commit suicide. There's a suggestion that he's already been medically discharged once under another different name, but in fact my research suggests that he's been enlisted and rejected twice, and once as a boy trying to join up. I'm still working on that, but I think he's tried it twice. In June 1914, he goes to prison for 21 months for burglary under the name of Frank Carr. This time it's for 11 burglaries in and around Great Portland Street in London with an accomplice. Some of the property that's stolen is given to two sweethearts as gifts. So he's due for release in November 1915. By 1916, he's back in the army with the Royal Fusiliers briefly. I've not been able to trace exactly when he enlists again, whether he was conscripted or whether he was the beneficiary of one of these early release schemes specifically to join back up. But by June 1917, he's a deserter, and he's wanted in Torquay and other places for thefts and deceptions. Now, the authorities are initially unsure who he is at that point, and the crime report in the Police Gazette just gives a physical description of the criminal. And that's on the first page of the edition where this photo appears. But they could do with a good editor because someone's put two and two together. So by page 3, they've got this photograph of him, and they're pretty convinced that this is the same man. And they refer to him as Frank Carr. He's said to be wearing a Royal Fusiliers uniform complete with wound stripes and sergeant stripes, and he's presenting himself as Company Sergeant Major Carter, presently on leave. He's also wanted in Blackpool for stealing from his lodgings. So the Police Gazette now have his picture, as you see here, and a couple of his known aliases, so the net's tightening. He steals £50 from the YMCA in Weymouth, and then he commits a series of frauds in Paignton and other towns in the vicinity, where he sells tickets for non-existent Red Cross fundraising shows. He turns up in Bognor Regis, claiming that he's there to arrange billets for 2,000 officers in order to get free accommodation and hospitality. In terms of the billeting, people were far more keen to provide billets for officers than they were for ordinary men. So again, we're using that class bias to try and get things for free. So he'd have been put up for free and got fed, etc., in the hope that he would find these premises suitable for the many officers that were going to flood into the town. Of course, this just didn't exist. He then goes to the other end of the scale and he starts going door to door, pretending that the army have authorised him to sell surplus coal to the poor at reduced prices. Very small amounts of money are sought for coal deliveries that obviously never arrive. And it's this that finally sees his downfall. This is what he's finally caught for. And he's sentenced to 3 years penal servitude for stealing these very small amounts of money. The other offence is taken into account. Now, the sentencing judge asks the army representative if they want him back before he imposes the sentence. And he gives a big sigh and says, "I'm afraid we'll have to take him back once you're done with him." And the judge reassures the officer that this will not be for a very long time and then gives him 3 years. He's not chosen to be released early under the release scheme. You may not be surprised at that. Serves his sentence at Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, and he continues his criminal career into the 20s, regularly serving sentences for burglary. So not only did the authorities have to deal with deserters from the British Army on the home front, They also had to worry about the thousands of troops from the Dominions who were in Britain at various stages of the war. As we know, the Canadians were here from November 1914, Australians from November 1915, both initially housed on Salisbury Plain. And at the high point of this in November 1916, there's nearly 216,000 Dominion troops stationed on British soil. So on this slide on the left, you'll see a poster for the YMCA's facility in London for Canadian troops, called it the Beaver Hut, which was a den of criminality of all kinds. In the middle, we've got the photo of pair of fairly stereotypical Aussie diggers. One of these chaps was a deserter. I'm trying to work out which one it is. I think they're brothers. One of them is definitely a deserter. I don't have any evidence at this stage that he committed any crimes, but he definitely was a deserter. And you'll be aware that the Australians had a very poor reputation, partially justified. Their behaviour in Egypt was 1915, was appalling, rioting, stealing, assaulting the locals, etc. And as you'll also know, there's no death penalty for Australian soldiers, so more of them were in prison for military offences. And in fact, the Australian infantry were given a whole prison at Lewes in order to house their offenders. By 1918, there's a gang of Australian deserters around Salisbury Plain who spent their time robbing and assaulting the local populace and even their own comrades. And in yet another shameless plug for other Western Front Association products, if you're interested in those rogue Aussies, please do seek out the recent podcast that the lovely and talented Tom Thorpe has done with Peter Stanley. I'll expect the check in the post, Tom. Canadians and Australians displayed the same levels of criminality as the British forces. And again, there are lots of these men, so I'm just picking this guy on your right for today's purposes. Charles J. Soden, rejected by the Canadian Expeditionary Force as undesirable, as many were before the regiment even left Canada, but he sneaked in under a different name and then went to England. He deserts in June 1915 and travels the country committing frauds and thefts. He buys a captain's uniform in London, which then allows him to go in and out of barracks nationwide, seemingly without challenge. He's then unsatisfied with the rank of captain and starts presenting himself as a major. So whilst he's in barracks, he would just help himself to pairs of binoculars, which he then sold, claiming to the buyers that he'd recovered them from the battlefield, where he hadn't. He'd just walked into a barracks and stolen them. He commits offences like this in Aldershot, Newcastle, Brighton, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Manchester, Liverpool, Cheltenham, Gloucester and Portsmouth. And he's eventually detained near Birmingham and he's sentenced to 18 months in prison by the civilian court. Talking about men committing bigamy and marrying war widows earlier, it was a particular problem, the bigamy side anyway, with Dominion troops. By 1918, it's such a problem that questions are being asked in Parliament, because British women are giving up jobs, pensions and sometimes homes after marrying overseas men who've already got families. One deceived woman wrote that the officer in command of the Canadian discharge depot at Buxton told her he had piles of letters from women who'd been tricked. The Scottish Registrar is well aware of the problem, writing that Dominion troops saw a trip to Scotland as a necessity to their home tour, and they seem to find feminine friends everywhere. So there are a number of these guys that defraud women generally, war widows in particular, when they've already got wives in Australia or Canada. And by 1919, the prosecution figures for the offence of bigamy are nearly 6 times higher than they were in the last year before the war. Now, both the AIF and the CEF leave soldiers from their ranks, serving sentences in British civilian prisons, whilst their comrades head back to Australia or Canada, including at least one murderer. And Australian newspapers report that there are around 300 men on the loose in Britain unaccounted for when the time comes to ship them back to Australia. So as I say, I've found some very audacious fraudsters, but one of the oddest stories that I've come across is that of John Smyrk, or rather a man pretending to be John Smyrk. So John James Smyrk of the 2nd Essex Regiment is by the summer of 1915 a prisoner of war in Germany. His family, who call him Jack, are aware of his location and are undoubtedly hoping that he can come home soon, perhaps in some kind of prisoner exchange or who would know the end of the war maybe. One day that summer, the summer of 1915, Corporal Smyrk's sister, Sarah, visits her father-in-law in Islington, and she discovers a man at the house who says he's a soldier who's been gassed at the front. The soldier's taking advantage of the hospitality of her father-in-law, Mr. Hazel. Sarah tells the stranger that he's the spitting image of her brother Jack, And the mystery soldier plays along and says that he knows Jack. When he's shown a photograph of Jack, he comes clean and he says that he is Jack Smyrk and he's come home as part of a prisoner exchange. He says that his experiences as a prisoner of war have much changed him, and he wants to make a quiet reappearance at home with no fuss. And he makes Sarah promise not to tell his mother yet. However, the juggernaut's already going down the hill and Sarah's convinced that this is her brother. So she takes him to see their mother. Jack Smyrk's mother is also delighted to see her son, as is his uncle, Robert Smyrk. Now, Jack Smyrk was engaged to a woman called Nellie Reed, and the next step is to be reunited with her, which he is. She's overjoyed to have him back, and he actually moves in with her family. She does wonder where the tattoo of her name that was on his arm when she saw him last has gone. But Jack tells her that the Germans removed the tattoo and re-tattooed him with these new ones that he's got now. Those beastly Huns stop at nothing. So Corporal Smyrk now applies to the War Office for the back pay he's owed, and also for the £5 grant he's entitled to as an exchanged prisoner of war. In fact, Jack Smyrk seems rather more fond of money than he was pre-war, and his uncle Robert now starts to have doubts that this is Jack. Robert eventually calls the police and claims that this man is a cuckoo in the nest and an imposter. Now, the investigating constables are confronted with strong denials from the soldier that he is anyone other than Jack Smyrk. He does, however, trip himself up by being unable to tell them his middle name, saying he doesn't have one. The fact that his eyes are also the wrong colour seems to be less important somehow. The police are faced with the problem, however, that Jack Smyrk's fiancée and her family are fully behind this man and maintain that this is Jack Smyrk. He's even charged with these offences of deception in the name of John Smyrk, because that's the only name that the police have. A bit more investigation yields his real identity, but it's only when the police bring a woman to court who gives evidence that she is his mother that the Reed family, his fiancée's family, and the defendant eventually accept reality. And this is not John Smyrk, this is a deserter called Thomas Baker. Baker was what we'd call a king's bad bargain, so discharged from the army before the war due to his criminal convictions and the amount of trouble that he constantly caused, but he fraudulently enlisted again in January 1915. He was then attached to the Seaforth Highlanders in Cromarty, but he deserted in the summer of 1915, made his way to London, where he invades the homes and affections of the Smyrk and Reed families. So when he is confronted with his real mother at court, I say he finally admits his real identity. And he's given the rather lenient sentence of 6 months imprisonment with hard labour for this very cruel deception. There is a happy ending to this story because the real John Smyrk does come home safely in a prisoner exchange, and he marries Nellie Reed in December 1918. Now, so these photographs here, the one on the left is the real John Smyrk. The one on the right is Thomas Baker. I can see no resemblance whatsoever between these two individuals. And it seems absolutely unbelievable that the family would accept him, even bearing in mind things like we're a much more kind of visual culture now, and people have photographs a lot more now than they did then, etc. But it seems unbelievable that his fiancée would think that this was the real man. However, I have had discussions with a member of the Smyrk family. I tracked somebody down, and she remembers Nellie and says she was known to be delicate. I think bad with her nerves would have been the phrase my household used when I was growing up. So who knows? Maybe she just didn't have her glasses on like me and couldn't see him properly. Interestingly, the surviving relatives knew nothing about this story at all. And it was me that told them about all this. They did not have a clue. One suspects that John Smyrk must have been told by somebody because it made the newspapers. It made some national newspapers at the time. But I suspect he was told a very heavily edited version of what actually went on. So let's check back on our parolees that we talked about earlier. There's a memo in November 1917 from the Home Office about how the men under that particular release scheme, the 1917 scheme, have done. 80 cases of habitual criminals released from preventative detention, like Victor March, our burglar, to join the forces. The report says 71 of them were satisfactory, 2 were fairly satisfactory, and only 7 out of the 80 were unsatisfactory. 5 joined the Navy, the rest were in the Army. 4 have been killed in action, 1 is a prisoner of war, and a number of them have been wounded. 1 of them has been pensioned and is described as working steadily. 3 of the bad ones have gone back to jail, getting fresh sentences of preventative detention and penal servitude. 1 is doing 2 years for desertion. 1 kept clean for 18 months, but is now doing 6 months hard labour for shop breaking, commercial burglary effectively. So what about R3? Well, 1 was shot for desertion, 1 was in and out of prison for years, and 1 became a hero. So I wonder if you've worked out which might be which. Well, there we go, the big reveal. Shot at dawn was John Butler Milburn, the man who had probably committed the least serious of the offences when he got his reprieve. Unlike the majority of the Shot at Dawn Brigade, he had a poor disciplinary record. He got 2 years imprisonment with hard labour by the Army in March 1917 for desertion, which was then suspended, and then he got the same sentence in July 1917 with the same suspension, interspersed with a bit of field punishment here and there for absence. In October 1917, he runs out of luck and he's sentenced to death for desertion, when it looks as though the allegation is that he's wounded himself rather than proceed to the front line, and he's shot in November 1917. Our chronic criminal is John James Bailey. No surprise there, I don't think. He got another 6 months imprisonment for theft in January 19 from a civilian court, then 2 years imprisonment with hard labour for desertion in 1919, to be discharged with ignominy at the conclusion. But after that, he manages to re-enlist somehow, but he continues to offend throughout the 1920s in various names. Which leaves our hero as Victor March, or should I say Alfred Prince Victor George March, which is how he's known on his Commonwealth wall grave at Peron Road Cemetery. He won both the Military Medal and a DCM, and his posthumous citation for the latter details the coolness and presence of mind he exhibited in pretending to be dead until a small party of Germans were close enough to shoot when he opened fire on their officer. The citation says that his courage and devotion have at all times greatly inspired the men with him. And in his pocket on his death in August 1918 is a copy of his prison release paper, his licence paper. Coolness and presence of mind are certainly required for a career as a burglar, so it's no surprise really that he had these traits. He also seems to have managed to have charmed several women as 2 separate women try and claim his medals. Poignantly, he's also commemorated at the prison chapel of HMP Camp Hill on the Isle of Wight, where he was serving his sentence before being released on licence. So I said that it was bookended by 2 murders, so the last one is fairly local, the Pontefract murder. This is Pontefract Magistrates Court, as was much missed. Closed now, like most places are. On the 16th of August 1918, Pontefract is shot by a murder in broad daylight, where widow Rhoda Walker, who owns a jeweller's shop, is found lying in the heavily blood-stained premises with serious head injuries. She dies in hospital without regaining full consciousness, and the search for her murderer commences. Now, witnesses had seen a soldier looking into the window of the jeweller's that afternoon, noting he was sporting some wound stripes on his uniform. Now, Pontefract, as you'll probably be aware, had long been a garrison town historically, and soldiers were a common sight. Mrs. Walker was said to be generous to the wounded soldiers who frequented her shop from the soldiers' home that was very close to the premises. Now, suspicion falls upon George Walter Cardwell and Percy George Barrett. They're both deserters from the Army Service Corps, and they've managed to get themselves jobs at Hemsworth Colliery. As you'll be aware, by this stage in the war, men are being released, not completely from the army, but to go back and work in the mines, because the need there is sometimes greater. And it was a perfect job for a deserter, because nobody's going to see you at work, are they? Because you're underground. And there's so much confusion over who's legitimately there and who isn't, that it must have been very easy to fool people. So this is what these 2 have done. Now, they'd returned to their lodgings with their army greatcoats on the afternoon of the murder. Not that suspicious, but what was suspicious was that they spent quite some time washing themselves when they got home, and then they left. Information's received from members of their family that they're on their way to London. So the police in London are alerted, and Cardwell's found at the address of a girlfriend on the Old Kent Road. Barrett's picked up in a public house a short time later. Both of them are in possession of blood-stained jewellery taken from Mrs. Walker's shop, and they're charged with murder. Their first appearance is here at Pontefract Magistrates Court, and it draws a big crowd, bolstered by the local miners who actually happened to be on strike at the time, so needed some entertainment. At their subsequent trial in Leeds, each defendant blamed the other for inflicting the injuries on Mrs. Walker. The jury retired for just 7 minutes before convicting them both, and the judge had no option but to impose the death penalty. They both appealed against their conviction, but that was unsuccessful, and both men were executed in Armley Prison here in Leeds in January 1919. Now, Cardwell reportedly had a good record as a soldier, being recommended for medals for gallantry, but he couldn't keep up his behaviour for the duration. As you've heard, he was a deserter at this point. He deserted in June 1918. He maintained his innocence of this crime to the last and expressed the hope in his letters home that his actions in the front line would save his reputation, if not his life. In one of his last letters to his father, he wrote, "If I have to face this disgraceful death, you can always say that I fought for a few years in France, and that no man can call me a coward who has ever been led by me in action out there." When the war broke out, George Cardwell was serving a sentence of Borstal detention, and he was one of the individuals who was released from custody under the royal prerogative of mercy on condition that he enlisted in the army. So there we have a quick run through, just so the book cover's burned into your eyes. There it is. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions if we have time.